I'm Dr. Linda Thornton, Associate Professor of Music Education at the Pennsylvania State University. And the theme for this talk is assessments. Now, most people really have their eyes roll back in their head when they think about assessment because it always sounds terrible, and you think about tests, and a lot of people actually start thinking about all the bad experiences they've had with assessments in the past. I want to talk to you about how you can maybe be thinking about assessments in a way that makes it a more positive experience as part of your teaching now or in the future. The main idea that I want you to be thinking about regarding assessments is that assessments should be associated with your goals. Ideally, those goals are based on what you believe your students need and where you would like them to go. So if you think about your assessments being associated with goals, that's the first step in making it a more positive experience. So what are the goals that you might have for your students? You can maybe try to think of a couple just off the top of your head, or as a student yourself, what are goals that you think that you've experienced in other classes? The second question then is, what are the priorities of those goals? I want you to take a moment and think about a teacher that you have now or have had in the past where you felt really good about their class, and maybe in particular the assessments that you had in the class, but maybe just the class in general. And do you know from reflecting on that experience what the goals were that that teacher had for you? And then think about, what do you think the priorities of those goals were that that teacher had? Do you feel you can identify that easily, or is that a little hard for you to determine? Now, this might be fairly obvious, but typically good assessments make it very clear what is important to that teacher. The students know, the teacher knows, and they're all traveling the same path together. So you want to consider, how are the priorities of the goals reflected in assessments? I'm going to share with you the results of a study that was conducted just a few years ago of music teachers. 91% of those music teachers felt that their assessments were focused on performance and skill achievement, which is the nature of their class, performance classes. Yet when the researchers actually looked at the assessments that they were using, only about 27% of the assessment of the final grade for the students was based on performance achievement. Almost the same amount, 25%, was based on attendance, another 25% was based on attitude, and then knowledge was an even smaller portion, about 11%. So when you think about the message that is sent to students by saying that attitude and attendance are as important as performance achievement in a performance class, there's when I think we start to have a mismatch between what the goals are that the teacher has and how the assessments reflect those goals. Now, I know that there's a lot of issues associated with the need for attendance and attitude being part of a grade in order for students to actually participate in the ensembles and that sort of thing. So I don't mean to diminish that, but what I'm wanting to challenge you to do is to consider, what is the proportion that performance should be in a performance class related to the message that that sends for what the student should actually know and be able to do after the class is over. I want to give you an example of this point. Probably some of you have sat in a class before where there's some student, while the teacher is lecturing, who raises their hand and says, "Is this going to be on the test?" And some of you kind of sigh and roll your eyes when that happens. But what is that student actually asking? When they're asking, "Is this going to be on the test?" they're actually saying, "Is this something I need to listen to? Is this something that I need to know to do well in this class?" It's not, "Is this something I need to know for life?" Is it going to be on the test? Do I need to be listening to you for my grade? That communication is really taught to students very early on. They start to learn that what they need to know is what's going to be on the test, and the rest of it just isn't important. The message that I really want you to remember is, if you don't assess it, students will think it's not important. So when we think about this in a music context, particularly regarding performance, if we don't assess expression, students get the message through the assessments that that must not be important. If our assessments focus on, are we playing all the right notes and rhythms, that is what they're going to believe is most important. If you are communicating to students what your goals are effectively, and I believe your goals probably are to make fabulous music, to be expressive in your playing, Your goals don't reflect that unless it's a part of your assessment, and the students won't understand that to be something that you are passionate about because you're not even bothering, in their mind, to include it on assessments. So I want to take you through very briefly an example of how you might develop an assessment based on something that is really important to you. The first thing you have to do is define it. What is it that you're going to assess? I like to use the example of thinking about a good driver. So if you're going to assess driving, what do you say is in the construct of a good driver and what is outside the construct of a good driver? It's usually easy for us to come up with ideas that are outside the construct of a good driver. People who don't do this, people who don't do that. So then you turn that into a positive. So people that don't change lanes suddenly without signaling. So a good driver is someone who changes lanes, who signals, for example. Put that in the context now of a good musician or a good performer or a good singer. What goes inside the construct? Sometimes thinking about what's outside the construct and making it into a positive. Think in your mind, what is a good, whatever it is you're wanting to assess, and what belongs on that list of the construct. After you're able to kind of define that into 4 or 5 different things, how can that person demonstrate to you that they're doing that? You want to select evidence. How is that person going to demonstrate that they are good at changing lanes, signaling when they change lanes, for example? And you might think, oh, well, I give them a driving test. That would be one way of selecting evidence. Then you need to think about how am I going to give them feedback on what they did for those things. So a lot of times we associate with driving, we associate a monitor who tells you whether or not you passed your driving test. But there's also along the way someone who sits in the car with you while you're learning to drive and says, don't forget to change your turn on your turn signal before you change lanes. That time you change lanes without using your turn signal. So how can you in your assessments be the person in the car with the driver? So if the idea is someone is a good performer, one aspect of a good performer is someone who sings with beautiful tone, how do you give feedback to that person that they are singing with beautiful tone? And how do you let them know when they're not singing with beautiful tone? Then the very last little piece of this is to develop instruction for the evidence. I said little piece, but that's certainly a very big piece. This is called backwards design. When you think about what the goal is and what you're trying to achieve, and then go through those steps to get to the point. So now what do I need to teach the students in order to be able to do those things in the way that I want them to do? So how do I teach a driver to change lanes while I help them remember to signal, and then be able to assess them doing what I taught them to do? I have just a couple of resources that I want to share with you that I consider to be really outstanding resources for music teachers. In particular, the Susan Farrell book has many examples of rubrics and projects and ideas that can be used to assess music teaching and learning. And I highly recommend that you look at the book for some of those ideas. But overall, I want you to remember, keep in mind what your priorities are. Keep in mind what your goals are. And your students are much more likely to achieve them if you have it focused in your own mind first.